Hello everybody, this is Havoc and welcome back to our Victoria 3 Developer Diary series. Today we are looking at Developer Diary number 24, Navies and Admirals. And this is kind of the other side of warfare from fronts and generals. We looked at that in the last Developer Diary. It is extensive, so if you want to, you can go back and watch it, but be sure to grab a snack or something because it's over an hour long. This one will be fairly shorter, and that's not to say because these aren't as fleshed out, but because there are so many mechanics that have kind of already been explained with fronts and generals, and there are a lot of similarities between them and navies and admirals, that there isn't as much explaining that needs to be done to be comprehensive. However, I will say that this does leave a lot of stuff open for interpretation and would be nice to be clarified because it's kind of basic right now, and not that that's a negative or bad thing at the moment, but what is explained here doesn't explain the whole picture, and we could see a lot of open interpretation. I'll just leave it at that. But anyways, before we get into this developer diary, as always, if you enjoy any part of this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on bell notifications. With that out of the way, let's dive into developer diary number 24, Navies and Admirals. So this developer diary does focus on navies and how Paradox intends to make them as strategically important to winning wars as they were historically. This diary builds on the warfare vision presented in the concept of war and many of the core mechanics presented in fronts and generals. So if you want to be fresh with those in mind, you can go back and read them, go watch the video. Otherwise, just tag right along. Your ability to sustain an empire depends to a large extent on how well you can compete on the high seas. This is an era of truly global trade, which also meant countries were highly susceptible to disruption of that trade, and the higher they climb, the harder they can also fall. In Vicky 3, maintaining a powerful blue water navy, that means a deep sea navy, is a large but necessary expense if you wish to ensure the integrity of your markets, overseas colonies, and trade routes during war. And even while at peace, a magnificent fleet can provide your nation with substantial prestige. So your navies will provide something in peacetime as well as war. Now this does leave a lot of questions in the air, because if that's the only thing that your navies do in peacetime, in my opinion, and talking with the other content creators, that almost seems a little too limiting, because that's not what navies did. They weren't just a prestige winner in essence during peacetime. They did a lot of roles while they were off the battlefield, or whatever you would want to call the naval version of that. So prestige is great, and hopefully it leads to other things outside of just a prestige level, because I don't want to micro my fleet during peacetime. That's not what this game is about, as we've said repeatedly, but I do want to be able to have my navy be more useful than just prestige gain, because as we're going to find out later on in the developer diary, these are constantly active. There is no mobilization, demobilization with regarding your navy, so keep that in mind. So their design intent for naval gameplay in Victoria 3 is that it should serve as a strategic precision instrument in conflicts between seafaring nations. The sea is not another front in a war, so we mentioned those fronts, and the front system, it works well to represent conflicts over land territories, I'll say, but would be nonsensical at sea, where no nation can be said to meaningfully control an enormous stretch of the ocean. So we are not going to see a Hoi 4 style system where your navy controls large sections of land, or sea rather. It's just not feasible, it's not accurate, and like I said, there'd be no real way to say, hey, I control this million square miles of sea. There's too much sea to be able to control that effectively. But instead, admirals and their flotillas are deployed to meet specific strategy objectives to disrupt the enemy's military operations or their economy, or defend against such attempts by the enemy. A powerful navy can never win you a war on its own, but if deployed correctly under the right circumstances, it can be the ace in the hole that lets you outsmart even a foe that's superior on paper. So it's basically this. We've seen in previous developer diaries where something like Great Britain has a vastly large navy, but maybe not a huge army. Like they said, your navies will not win you wars. Now, if you're not at war, maybe your navy could be that ace in the hole to help win the war of your allies. But you're going to have to balance an army and a navy if you want to succeed in this global scale conflict or this global expansion. If you don't care about that, then your navy may not be as useful, especially obviously if you're landlocked. But considering it contributes to prestige right now, it's a good idea, even if you are landlocked, to expand out and try and grab a port to then see if you can economically build a navy, building up your prestige and allowing you to do more things than you could if you were just landlocked. And with this first image, we see a rather beautiful picture. This is, of course, work in progress. All of this is work in progress, but it's a clipper departing Luanda in the Portuguese colonial state of North Angola, representing the colony's connection to the market capital in Lisbon. We see our first image of our trade nodes, or at least our trade routes, if you want to call them. I do believe they actually called nodes, but this is going to play a huge part in how naval warfare works. They said we're not controlling regions, which is true, but we are going to have objectives that focus on these trade nodes and what you can do with them and how that will impact the scale of your war, as well as the scale of the economy of the people who are affected by those trade nodes, which is, spoiler alert, everyone. So as with land warfare and generals, you control your navy through your admirals. Generals and admirals operate almost identically. They are both provided with military resource originating from buildings in strategic regions they call home. The amount of resources they get depend on their rank, which you can grant via promotions to reward your favorite commanders, and their rank lends to political clout and strength for your character's favorite interest group. Furthermore, both generals and admirals, as we mentioned in the last developer diary, get traits that affect themselves and those officers and servicemen serving underneath them. So again, admirals are pretty much the exact same as generals, just obviously at the sea, which is great. You don't really need a distinction between the two. It simplifies code, it simplifies operations. You're not having to worry about doing a whole bunch of things like that. What I would like to know is that if for some reason you lost a really good general and you had a really good admiral based on his skills, not necessarily naval skills, if you can switch your commanders to go between the two. Can I have an admiral? Like I said, I lost a really good general. I only have one really good admiral. I can kind of, tell my navy to go home, do what they need to do, switch out admirals even, but then switch that admiral over to a general. It'd be a little bit wonky and probably not terribly historically accurate. But if I lost someone critical and I had someone to replace them despite where they served, I wonder if we could switch them. It's just a little tidbit that I thought about as I was reading this, but since they are so close to being the same, I wouldn't mind the crossover just for gameplay purposes. Most importantly though, just like generals are your interface to command your armies, admirals are the interface for your navies. Admirals are given orders, just like generals are, which they attempt to carry out to the best of their ability while using the flotillas they have assigned. These orders consist of intercept, which is intercepting any hostile navies around a certain strategic region's friendly coastlines while keeping your fleets stationed close to shore. So this is a very coastal coast guard kind of operation. You can patrol, which means you patrol any shipping lanes between the admiral's home region and a remote region, intercepting any hostile navies encountered. You have convoy raid, which is a convoy raid at a particular point at sea to damage enemy shipping lanes. And you have a naval invasion to establish a beachhead and a front line on enemy soil by escorting and protecting a general's land forces in a joint operation. Now, it's an important distinction to make that I didn't grab it first, that I'm just going to say here in case you feel the same way, is that all of these are wartime orders. None of these are peacetime, as far as we know anyway. So intercepting makes sense for piracy, and even though piracy wasn't terribly large, it was still there, it still happened. But none of these, even a patrol, it makes sense to patrol so you're not caught off guard, but all of these are wartime functions. None of these are designated as peacetime. And it's this sort of deal that I hope we get to see during peace, because for instance, Great Britain's going to have the largest navy at the beginning of the game. If they have nothing to do during peace and they just sit at home, or they sit in one of those regions, they are essentially consuming resources, goods, and people for literally nothing. And if it almost discourages a peaceful playthrough, which I know if you're Great Britain, you're probably not focusing on that, but it does kind of prevent you from balancing that Navy army, because if you can't do things during peacetime with your Navy outside of prestige, there's really no use in having them during peacetime. But it also takes a while to build up. You can't tear them down probably very effectively. And so we just need things to do during peace. So just wanted to clarify, these are war orders. These are not peace orders, but I hope we do have some sort of semblance of deeper mechanics involved during peacetime. The last actual order they get is that it hasn't made its way into the game yet, but they also want to add a 5th order, blockade, which is to disable enemy ports and prevent hostile forces from crossing straits. This is especially true for the peacetime thing. I think there should be a way to blockade a potential enemy, someone you don't have good relationships with. You should be able to peacefully blockade and prevent them from economically being substantial. I think you should suffer an infamy hit depending on the nation. I think you should suffer some diplomatic hits for doing it. But there are times where that infamy hit or that diplo negative is going to be worth the cost. If you have a nation who is just much too powerful and they are bullying you from a land perspective, but they are very heavily reliant on naval trade, then you could blockade a certain trade node, kind of strangle them economically to where they might back down if you're able to provide that sort of blockade. So again, we need some peaceful, aggressive things to do, or even some peaceful defensive things to do with our navies, or else it's going to probably, in my opinion, lead to some of the larger nations always being overpowered because their navies are always available, not scattered across the world, doing upkeep things to keep their empire together. And so when they go to war, they're all right there, and it's going to be hard to kind of tackle them effectively as a smaller nation, I should say. And we have our first admiral image, who is Dionisio Ruiz from Spain. Very clearly, the Iberian H quarter. This is an artistic markup of the admiral in his naval panel. He has 10 flotillas, and they are currently on an intercept duty in the Iberian HQ, ensuring that no naval invasions or blockades endanger the Spanish home front. So lots of things that are going on here. Again, you're always taking attrition. His flotilla, I don't know if that's just the standard Navy button or if there are degrees of quality in flotillas, I should say. These do look a little more aggressive than their army counterparts regarding the icons, but I do like it. I do enjoy it. I think it works very well. And again, I enjoy the order system so far. I just think it's a little bit incomplete. Now, as I just said, convoy, raid, and naval invasion are going to be aggressive orders, and orders intended to hurt the enemy in different ways, while intercept and patrol are these defensive orders that counter the other two. But to really understand how these work, we have to start by talking about shipping lanes and the supply network. And this is really, really cool. Shipping lanes are facilitated by vessels called convoys, which are an output of port buildings. So port buildings operate like other buildings in the economy of Vicky 3. And so in this case, their output, their product is going to be convoys. These are created automatically whenever it's necessary to move goods and or people overseas. Now, keep that in mind. You'll need convoys in order to move troops across the sea, right? But you're going to have your Navy to support them. The three main reasons this happens are due to naval trade routes between non-adjacent markets, remote states connecting to their market through a port, and battalions sent to front lines that can only be supplied by ships. So your navies will not be transporting per se. It'll be more of escorting. That's the word I'm thinking of. When a player is about to take an action that establishes such a shipping lane, they are warned of how many convoys would be required for this action, which is based on the size of the route the army supplied. This is good. That means that a smaller trade route is going to require not as many convoys, whereas something that goes from Great Britain all the way to Indochina is going to require a vast amount. And we're going to see the product of that here in a second and how it affects your economy overall, and why, and the culmination of this, it is going to be important to keep those trade lanes open. So that same image of the North Angolan shoreline has been expanded in this image, which shows the main route ships travel off the coast of Southeast Africa. So we see the large trade route node going in, and the yellow pin indicates the path that is part of Portugal's supply network. Now, this is an important distinction. These nodes that you see are tied to a specific country, or at least that's how I read it. And so until that port was established over there in Angola, you're not going to see those smaller lines. And I would imagine that maybe you wouldn't even see them if you were clicking or if you were as a different country. But what is interesting here is that they all kind of have the same point, regardless of distance. This is, I think, a simplification. Obviously, I don't know that those ports up north or those trade routes that you see up north, the smaller lines, doesn't make sense that they would go all the way to this trade node, but it's going to be important to have distinctions during warfare and even to know where your own trade routes are. But still, it looks great. This is a fantastic picture. It doesn't show too incredible much detail, but it does look very gorgeous. The sum total of a country's shipping lanes determines the extent of its supply network, and the total cost in convoys of that network compared to the convoy output by ports determine the overall strength of that network. So it's a little bit of a confusing statement, but essentially the shipping lanes and supply network are all tied together, and then the number of convoys determine its ability to effectively do product shipping. That is to say, if the total shipping lane cost is 500 convoys, but ports only provide 400, the supply network as a whole will operate at only 80% efficiency. Now, the big picture here is that this impacts all shipping lanes, causing less trade to flow between the markets that would then be optimal and impacting the supply and morale of overseas troops. So if I have a supply network that isn't fully 100%, any network, any shipping lane that is tied to this network, regardless of where it is in the world, is impacted by it. That makes sense. If you have a slowdown in trade in a specific region, it is going to cause a backup. It's going to cause issues all the way throughout every single shipping lane that it affects. And then, of course, again, the supply and morale of overseas troops. If you're only operating at 80% efficiency, your own convoys are not enough to get those troops the supplies they need, which therefore will determine morale. So you want to do your best to fill it up as appropriate as you can, but I would safely guess that most of these trade routes or supply lanes from the get-go aren't going to have a full supply network. And it'll be really good to see how you can optimize your ports in order to create that optimal setup. Now, admirals assigned to convoy raid a given sea node will be surreptitiously, that's a big word for me, try to sink any enemy transports that pass through it. In effect, this will do damage over time to the affected shipping lanes, causing both an overall drop in efficiency of the affected country's supply networks, but also a larger local drop in efficiency of the damaged shipping lanes. As a result, by parking your fleet in a highly trafficked part of the ocean, you could do a lot of damage to your enemy's trade or even directly impact the amount of military supplies they are to send to their front lines. I feel like this is a crucially important aspect and concept to consider when it comes to naval warfare in the game, and why building a navy is so important, or at least figuring out how to use your potentially smaller navy to its best advantage. What we have to remember is that we cannot micro these fleets. We can give orders to them. So if we have an admiral and we give an order to convoy raid, we can't play skipperoo, we can't play hide and seek on our own. We have to trust that whatever the admiral does, however many ships he sinks, however he goes about his business, that he won't get detected, and that we can stay in that trade node and wreck as many things as possible without getting seen, because that is a factor, as we'll see here in a little bit, that just because you sit there on a trade node doesn't mean you're automatically discovered. It will take some time, and also depends on a lot of other things. Now, this is a very visually unpolished view of Portugal's supply network, which is the pink lines that you can see. Now, what we have to remember, as always, is that pretty much anything in pink in any game really, but especially in Paradox games, particularly represent placeholder images. Now, it's a really good distinction between your own network and others, so I wouldn't mind if it stayed or if you could customize it. But we could see in this image that your trade networks are vast. It does a whole lot of stuff and can affect different parts of the world. Now, again, this is Portugal's supply network. We can see those major trade routes. And again, assuming that pink is Portugal's own, as Great Britain, that may look a little different. What I want to know is that are these trade nodes, I guess, always there no matter what? And then depending on the country, depends on the route. So as Great Britain, do I follow that northwest corner to go to the Americas and then I branch off to the north where Portugal doesn't at all? If I'm going to India, do I follow most of those same trade nodes? And if I do, what happens when I myself convoy raid, say Germany follows the same route? Will it affect Portugal's? And if it affects Portugal's, do I see a diplomatic hit? There's a lot of things. Or do we have the distinction? Does the AI have the distinction between friend and foe? Or will it just straight up sit on a trade node and raid supplies and raid every single convoy, it seems? Because it seems like it'd be naturally intuitive that it would have a distinction between friend and foe. But maybe it doesn't, and maybe that's the risk of convoy raiding and or blockading. So again, there's a lot of things that aren't really discussed well, but still this looks, even though it says it's visually unpolished, it still is visually pleasing and helping you understand the trade system in this thing. And it's also crazy to see here that at the beginning, we don't have the Suez Canal. Now the Suez Canal is a relatively modern project, but I do believe at one point we could maybe do it in the game. I don't remember if those massive projects, if that was part of it or not, but it would be really cool to see, and then to see the dynamic change between trade and functionality, because if we don't have to go all the way around the Horn of Africa, we could go straight through the Mediterranean, changes up the economic balance and where you put your navies at. But anyways, this is a very visually unpolished view of Portugal's supply network, which stretches from the Azores around the African continent all the way to the Portuguese Bombay. In the lower right corner, we see an additional tendril going east, which is a trade route importing porcelain from China. So overall, lots of things that we can determine from here. I'm not going to do too much into some heavy speculation, but it does look very functional and very well thought out and comprehensive. I mean, this makes a lot of sense. It looks good. I can easily determine, okay, as Portugal, this is what I have to deal with and where I have to be at. Now, admirals assigned to patrol a certain area of their supply network will eventually be able to detect and engage the raiding navy, causing a naval battle to ensue, which will not only sink ships, but also send the losing side back to their base for repairs for some time. We don't know how much, we don't know how that happens, but that's what happens when at the end of a battle, you go all the way back to home base. Admirals assigned to intercept all nodes along the coastline are able to do the same to any raiders along the coast. Convoy raiding right outside a major entry-exit port, such as the English Channel, therefore has the chance to seriously disrupt a large number of shipping lanes, but also put you at a greater risk of detection and interception than if you're raiding a transatlantic shipping lane on the deep sea. This is essentially taking the aspect of vast tracts of the ocean and condensing it to something that is, again, more strategic rather than tactical. If you are doing something on the English Channel, that's a very thin, narrow stretch of land, or sea rather, so you're going to have a greater chance of being detected, even though you could disrupt a lot of shipping lanes. Whereas if I'm invading or if I'm raiding that's something that goes into the Caribbean, or even something that goes into the Canary Islands and things of that nature, it's going to be a little bit harder for me to be detected. But if I'm there long enough, or if there's an enemy flotilla that is on that intercept patrol course, then they will eventually find me, and that could result in some disastrous effects. The composition of your navy can also greatly impact how this plays out. A fleet with an accompaniment of submarines can deal damage before being intercepted, while a fleet of monitors has an easier time intercepting raiders, but may be more easily sunk if faced down by a more powerful navy. Now, submarines, I don't recall, actually, never mind, I'm completely wrong. Forget what I was gonna say. But regarding submarines, if we pulled a German World War I attempt, and we had just a naval flotilla of nothing but submarines, we could be very, very deadly with it. And in fact, it may even be a case where attacking the English Channel is a little more viable, simply because I would say probably defensive, but even offensive capabilities of submarines to remain undetected. Now, we need to know more about how a flotilla gets detected, if there are traits that can prevent that from happening, if weather prevents that from happening, things of that nature. But it's a fascinating concept to think that your composition, it makes sense, but your composition affects how detectable you are, and then also how effective you are at fighting that. If you could, I wonder if you could have two generals in which you have one general that does, let's just say it's raiding convoys, and the other one is defending that same shipping lane. Could you tag team an area where you could effectively use your submarines to raid those shipping lanes while also protecting them in different detection intercept modes from a different flotilla? That's getting a little too more on the tactical side for me to be super comfortable with, but it is a viable strategy that I think that could work, or at least be exploited by the players. And that means that finding a way around not being able to micro by having two fleets do kind of opposing orders that covers you in different ways. Again, your submarines are going to have a harder time being detected, but once they are detected, they could then get intercepted by another flotilla to try and kill the enemy flotilla. It's all a little complicated. Again, it's a little too micro heavy for me, but I do wonder if that sort of system is implemented or might be implemented in the future. Now, something else to consider, because the distance admirals must patrol plays a difference, there's an inherent asymmetry to convoy raiding and patrol orders. This is a very crucial thing to understand. Since a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, the damage done to a shipping lane by raiders is the same whether it stretches across one node or 10. We mentioned that efficiency even is the same deal. Well, if you are raiding, you are destroying convoys. Destroying those convoys reduces the efficiency of the node. Only in this case, it's not because your ports aren't pumping out enough convoys, it's because your convoys are being sunk. Now, so it makes sense that one node affects the same amount as 10 nodes, but you're going to need 10 times as many flotillas to protect that longer route as effectively as the shorter. This also makes sense. It's going to take a smaller fleet to protect the English Channel than it will be to protect the entire transatlantic trade route. This is where it gets really kind of crazy. And again, this is an unpolished, unfinished version that we're about to look at. But in this image here, we see the Micronesian Sea and its supply network and all of the nations that are affected by it, along with their orders. Now, I would imagine you can see this at any time, which is also a little bit crazy because then you can kind of pick and choose who you want to mess with. For instance, we can see Great Britain has a supply network in this sea node. Commander Albert Ashton is tracing supply. We don't know what tracing supply means, and I don't even want to try and anticipate what it could mean. But that would be me anticipating and speculating. France has a supply network and is importing fabric from the American market to the French market. Austria is importing coffee and dyes. The United States is importing luxury furniture, luxury clothes, and wine. Denmark is supplying network, has a supply network. That's it. They're not doing anything. It means they don't have a navy actively involved in there, or they don't have any trade in the area, but that is part of their supply network. Maybe they're going through it and not actually doing anything inside of it. This is a really good breakdown and overview, even if it's an unfinished version, because it does mean we can take a look at any trade node and any supply network, and we can see how we can affect that network with our own navy. If I plan on going to war with Morocco, I can see that in the Micronesian Sea, they are importing small arms and artillery, and they're exporting iron. So if we were to blockade that trade node during war, say Morocco is an enemy of our ally, then I can be like, okay, they may not need my help in a land battle, but you know what? If I blockade their port, if I blockade that supply network in the Micronesian Sea, and I can hold my ground, I am removing small arms, I am removing artillery, so that already is reducing the supplies, which would reduce the morale of the troops affected in that area. But on top of that, I am hurting them economically because I am preventing them from exporting iron. So it's kind of a two-step hit here, in that an economic and a military challenge in deciding which ones you want to protect. It's the same, or destroy rather, but it's the same as the defender. If I am Morocco and my ally goes to war with someone, I may realize that, hey, if I'm going to win this war, help my ally on land, I need lots of small arms. I need lots of artillery. I need to defend the Macaronesian, excuse me, I've said Macaronesian, the Macaronesian Sea supply network, because it's going to help me contribute to my ally, or me contribute in a war, while also keeping me economically substantial in the supply network. I really enjoy this thing because it will play into the politics of it all, which also, speaking of politics, kind of leads me into that whole peacetime diplomatic play thing. It just kind of popped into my head just now, that can you use your navy to kind of preemptively set up some things? So say a diplomatic play is coming along where you can mobilize, you can start mobilizing your army, but your fleet's already going to be mobilized, as we're about to see. Can I go ahead and start moving my navy? Do we have the naval fronts, as it were? Can they go to an area before the war even begins? Because if I wanted to make sure this war was quick, I would move my entire fleet to the Macaronesian Sea to establish my dominance offensively, saying, hey, I'm getting ready to prevent you from your land army being supplied. But also from a defensive point, look, I know where I need to defend. I'm going to camp here and be ready to go once the timer goes. Again, there's so many questions that pop up, but it's still relevant, and I still think it's a great system so far. And it's doing a fairly good job of giving us a great overview. Now, moving on to naval invasion. It's an order you give to provide naval support for a general's landing on an enemy coastline. The size of the fleet determines two things. One, how great is the chance you'll be able to defeat an opponent's intercepting fleet? And two, how many battalions you'll be able to safely and successfully land. Even if the enemy has no defensive fleet, naval invasion with a very small fleet might land too weak of an initial force to withstand the enemy's counteroffensive before the rest of the army can arrive. Since naval invasion is a one-time order, once it has been completed, it automatically turns into a patrol order to protect the shipping lane supplying the new front. And we get a great image. Two fantastic pieces of artwork for concept art of the early ship of the line and a late game dreadnought class vessel. So regarding your naval invasions, it's very logical to assume that the larger your fleet is, the more battalions you can protect. And a kind of devil's advocate, I can see that certain traits might not be that per se. For instance, I think like a reckless admiral or reckless general, you could have that recklessness be, hey, I know my fleet isn't large enough, but let's try and squeeze a few more battalions in here to see. And it would be a risk versus reward. Do you have your admiral, or will your admiral potentially sacrifice some battalions just to try and get more people across the shore? Because again, your navy is not, while it determines the number of battalions, it is not transporting the battalions themselves. Your convoys are. It is simply protecting those convoys. So if you have a risky general or a risky admiral who likes taking those risks, it would be cool to see, hey, the trait when invading is that I get plus 30% battalions at the, the RNG of potentially losing some from when they get intercepted or something. And then of course, just seeing I know these are concept arts, but I'm really excited. It makes me excited to see what they'll look like in game, because these are gorgeous little mock-ups. And I would really like to see them in the game. So now that we have the orders out of the way, we're going to dig into the navies themselves and how they operate. Navies are made up of flotillas, which are constructed and maintained by naval bases. Naturally, these can only be built on coastlines, where they consume military vessels such as man-of-wars or ironclads constructed in shipyards. Like barracks, they also employ servicemen and officer pops. And depending on your navy configuration, they may need to consume other military goods as well, like ammunitions or radios, in order to keep in good fighting condition. Flotillas differ from battalions in how long it takes to create and upgrade them, though. Constructing a competitive navy is not something you can begin considering when your rivals already started saber rattling. So again, your navies, just by default, they're going to take a longer time to construct, to get up and running. You can't try and start a navy at the beginning of a diplomatic play hoping that it will be done by the time that diplomatic play turns into a war. Another difference between battalions and flotillas is that your country's navy is always considered to be in full active service. I mentioned this a few times already. In peacetime, generals can keep their troops on low alert, limits their consumption, and it limits their expenses. Once war breaks out, generals can be selectively mobilized to only deploy the troops necessary. Admirals don't have that luxury. They have exorbitant needs and expenses even while at peace, so sizing and teching your navy appropriately is an important consideration for imperialists on a tight budget. Now again, they keep saying tight budget, and I keep thinking that a tight budget isn't going to be a big deal because of how expansive your budget really is, in that you can be in debt but still operate fully functionally well. But this also means and goes back to my peacetime thing. If my general or if my admirals and my flotillas are always active, there's always stuff going on, and they are constantly taking huge chunks of money, of supplies and things of that nature, I need more things I can do with them during peacetime, where I'm going to have a hard time justifying the cost. And with navies taking so long to build up, it doesn't make sense for me to disband navies during peacetime because I won't have enough time to get them up and running for wartime. It's just something that keeps coming back to me that I really hope they expand on, because we need something and a use for navies during peacetime, especially considering that Vicky 3's whole spiel is that war isn't something that happens all the time. It's a continuation of diplomacy. We need that end of the diplomatic system. In this image, we see the artistic mock-up of the Navy panel with the flotillas expanded. Admiral Alvarez de Toledo commands 20 flotillas of man-of-wars on a patrol mission to secure an important shipping lane. So much going on here. And again, the monitor Magnanime and the monitor Galui II. I imagine that those icons will change to better represent the actual ships rather than the infantry, but again, it is what it is. I'm not going to heavily critique that. And we can also see that that is quite a few man of wars, and goodness gracious, we don't know what all the symbols mean, especially under the Galicia flotillas, but overall it looks like a rather powerful navy. I would like to know how big that is compared to something like Great Britain's, as well as how much prestige something that a 40 unit flotilla would contribute to, because it's kind of important in this game, determines your ranking as well. So knowing the effectiveness of a navy would be good information to have. With all of that in consideration, this last section is a really, really good explanation on an order that we've had, I think, in previous games, but also an order that is almost too macro in scale, and why they removed it or don't straight up don't have one. So they want to say a few words about the lack of an order to just seek out and destroy enemy forces. In Victoria 3, your commanders, which are your generals as well as your admirals, are given strategic objectives, which they will use their manpower and resources to carry out as best as they can. If in the process they get into conflict with enemy forces, a battle will ensue, and the outcome of that battle determines which direction the war proceeds. The intent of this is to remove the need to babysit your commanders. And to illustrate this, assume that we did have an order to seek and destroy. The optimal choice would then be to assign this order only to your strongest commander, fight the eventual battle, then revoke this order and give it to other commanders, while the first one recuperates, so on and so forth. Yet with an order like Advanced Front instead, the general's intentions is simply to recapture territory as efficiently as possible, ideally while avoiding enemy interference. If it's impossible to avoid the enemy, the imperative is to try to be intercepted by as weak of an enemy force as possible. Meanwhile, the intent behind Defend Front is the opposite. You want to prevent the enemy incursions by defending it in the first places where the enemy might be advancing, bringing to bear as powerful of a force as possible. Which similarly at sea, Convoy raiding is about maximizing shipping lane damage while avoiding detection, while Patrol is about maximizing damage to convoys by seeking out and destroying those enemy ships attacking them. Not to sink ships, just to sink ships. So depending on how the war is developing, your priorities or overall strategies might shift, causing you to change the orders you've assigned or make changes in your ranks to distribute resources differently. But our design intent, the Paradox's design intent, is that this should be only necessary because your strategy is evolving, not to counter enemy movements or to try and min-max your way to victory. This is a big distinction in Victoria 3, and I think a big reason why they wanted to take out the tactical side of battles. Because as a player, you have the ability to outsmart the enemy. You just do. The way our brains operate, we don't have actual artificial intelligence behind these games. It's virtual intelligence. That is if-then scenarios. They don't think for themselves necessarily. They are running solely by code. So a player always has the capability of min-maxing and getting around them because they simply have the capability to think freely as well. So this is a big reason why I'm glad they took out warfare, and at least in the way we see it, because, well, let me finish. Now, this is an especially important consideration for the naval part of warfare mechanics. Naval and aerial warfare and strategy games commonly face the design challenge of extreme mobility options due to the lack of obstacles to movement. That is, you're in the sea, you're in the air. Usually some form of fog of war and interception radius mechanics are employed to counter turtling behavior. The AI often has to be forced to make mistakes, not become too good at dodging or intercepting the player in this kind of an environment. Even with Victoria 3's more strategic level decision making, the freedom of movement the sea provides would make a system where being in or avoiding being at the same location as the enemy is extremely micro heavy, annoying and highly unfair to either human or AI players depending on implementation. So instead, in Victoria 3, you tell your admirals the overall priority should be for the war, and then they will try to do that using the resources they've been allocated, only coming into conflict when they become aware of an enemy admiral, excuse me, I'm talking too fast, with an order that clashes with their own. I like this, and this is what I wanted to say before I read that last paragraph. One of the most frustrating things in all Paradox games is the micro-clicking, trying to, oh, the AI is going here, I'm going to go here, oh, now they're to do that micro movement. They've taken that away, and they've taken that away especially for sea and air battles because it's just too micro heavy. It's just too much, and it isn't terribly fair to either side. So what they've done now is that by simply giving orders, if you have an enemy navy that is raiding the same supply line that you are patrolling, at some point they will clash. And in which case, with that patrol order, they are initially seeking out and destroying to intercept that raiding party. So they do have a seek out and destroy, but it's not for the sole purpose of seeking out and destroying. It is they have an order to patrol and defend their lands, or their routes, excuse me, and they will eventually meet up with that navy unless that other navy is giving an order that does not come into conflict with it. I like it. I like it because it takes away the micro heaviness of it. This is an economic political simulator. This is not a warfare simulator. And so while these have been simplified, it doesn't mean that it's not complicated, that it's not in depth. And I think that distinction has to be made, because I feel like people are just going to be like, well, I don't want to play this because I can't micro my troops, which isn't the point of the game anyways. But nonetheless, it's something that I very much enjoy, so I can focus on the economy, so I can focus on, all I have to do is kind of glance over at my generals and my admirals, see how they're doing, update their orders. Now, speaking of updating orders, one thing that hasn't been mentioned here, and one thing that I'm afraid of, is this idea of instant compliance. If I am the player and my home is in London, my empire's in London, and I have troops in Africa, I'm afraid that if I give an order to a general to start defending instead of keeping on attacking, that order is going to be instantly obeyed and applied. I would almost like to see the fact just time travel, which would affect order travel. If they're X amount of distance away, it's going to take X amount of days before that general or that navy gets that order. If my navy is halfway across the ocean before radios are invented, it's going to take a long time to get an order from the king or the official who's in charge of that to get that order and then comply with it. This would add a little level of depth and immersion that I would really, really enjoy. And that it would probably be a little bit frustrating, but let's just say, for instance, that I'm holding a defensive ground and I've been holding it for a long time and I see my opportunity. Well, as soon as I see that opportunity, I have to give the order to attack. Well, again, without the idea of generals teleporting instantaneously or orders instantaneously teleporting, what if they're defending, and it takes a week of in-game time before they get the order to attack? And by that time, an army of a much more local place has already issued different orders and may be attacking as well. Again, this kind of would give a depth and immersion that would be really fun and entertaining to see, because it means that the further you expand, the harder it is to hold on to those territories. That's kind of what I'm afraid of with this game, is that if you have large territories across the world, it's going to be a little too simple to keep them, and especially to hold them in a war. We need something to challenge us in that way, which would add a level of depth to your wars that isn't tactical, but is more strategic minded. Yeah, and it's something to think about. Let me know what you think about it in the comment section down below. But hopefully that everything will be, kind of explained further in detail. And this wraps up the end of the developer diary, by the way. The naval mechanics, I won't say they're simple. I will say they seem rather limiting, again, because this is naval warfare, so I get we're focusing on the warfare side, but the fact that they've mentioned prestige means that they have considered the peacetime things, and the fact that they have only mentioned prestige in regards to peace has me a little concerned that your navies won't have a lot to do during peacetime, and that it will be a very, very heavy economic expense where they aren't utilized fully, because navies were used in peacetime just as much as they were, well, probably not as much as they were in wartime, but they were used to bully some things around. They blockaded I say peacefully. They blockaded without going to war. We see that several times throughout history. We see navies putting pressure in certain economic or political situations to turn things around. Could you put a large flotilla in a colony that has unrest and use that as a military suppression to limit the unrest, or maybe it would cause a surmounting of it? As I mentioned with blockading, it would have a negative effect because you would slowly gain infamy, maybe depending on the size, maybe depending on how the other countries view that country. If we are blockading a nation that isn't well liked, maybe we get a small diplomatic boost to all the countries that agree with it, while gaining infamy and a diplomatic decrease with all the countries that don't agree with it. So there's a lot of peacetime things that I feel like we can use with our navies and our admirals that wasn't explained in the developer diary that I hope we get to see. Now, there are tons of other questions that I have, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. That's more for the other channels to do. That's kind of their forte. I'm more just explaining the mechanics to you in the way I can and explaining my thought process behind it all. But as I mentioned, guys, that's going to be the end of this developer diary. I really enjoyed the aspect of navies and admirals. We are going to see the last developer diary focusing on the military system by focusing on the economic impacts of warfare with the next developer diary, and that will end the military focus. So we're going to get beyond that after this week. So I might do some sort of military overview if that's something you guys would enjoy, kind of an in-depth look and comprehensive look into what Vicky 3 is approaching with its military system once we have the entire economic or the military warfare overview. Let me know if you want that by leaving comment in the comment section. But as always, guys, if you enjoy any part of this, be sure to give it a thumbs up, sub to the channel, turn on bell notifications. I'm still really enjoying these. I'm going to stick with it because it gives me a better comprehension of the game, and hopefully it gives you a understanding from my perspective as both a experienced player-ish in Paradox games, but also a completely new player in the Victoria series. Thanks for watching, guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. This is Havoc, and I'll see you in the next one.
Up. Up over the smokestacks. rose a promise of a grand tomorrow.